The courtroom was packed, with people spilling into the hallways outside. Some were there out of curiosity, others out of respect for the man standing at the center of it all, a decorated Army general who had served his country for over 3 decades. His uniform hung neatly pressed in a glass case nearby as evidence of his service, but today he wasn't wearing it. Instead, he stood in a plain suit, his face calm despite the weight of what was happening around him. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, cleared her throat before speaking. Everyone leaned forward slightly, holding their breath. After months of hearings, testimonies, and arguments, this was the moment everyone had been waiting for: the verdict. "General," Judge Harper began, her voice steady and firm, "after careful consideration of the facts presented during this trial, I have reached my decision." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. Then she said it, those 2 words that would change everything: guilty as charged. A ripple went through the room. Gasps, murmurs, even a few tears broke the silence. For the general, though, there was no visible reaction. He stood tall, shoulders squared, accepting the blow without flinching. But inside, something stirred, a mixture of disbelief, frustration, and maybe even fear. The charges against him were serious. He was accused of stealing millions of dollars meant to support troops overseas. According to the prosecution, he'd funneled the money into secret accounts, lining his own pockets while soldiers suffered. It sounded unthinkable for someone of his rank and reputation. Yet, the evidence seemed undeniable, at least on paper. Receipts, bank statements, emails, it all pointed directly at him. When the judge announced the sentence, life imprisonment without parole, the room erupted again. Supporters shook their heads in disbelief, while those convinced of his guilt nodded solemnly. Life behind bars? For a man who had dedicated his entire life to serving his nation? It felt surreal. As the gavel came down, signaling the official end of the trial, most people filed out of the courtroom, whispering among themselves. But not Judge Harper. Once the crowd thinned, she stayed seated, staring at the empty space where the general had just stood. Something about the case gnawed at her. Sure, the evidence looked solid, but there were moments during the trial when things didn't quite add up. Little inconsistencies here and there that she couldn't ignore. She glanced at the bailiff, who was tidying up some papers. "Can you get me a secure line?" she asked quietly. "A secure line, Your Honor?" the bailiff replied, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," she said firmly. "I need to make a call to the Pentagon." Her request sent a chill through the air. Why would a judge need to contact the highest levels of military command after delivering such a heavy sentence? Whatever her reasons, they clearly weren't ordinary. As the bailiff scrambled to arrange the connection, Judge Harper sat back, in her chair, lost in thought. What if the man she'd just sentenced wasn't guilty after all? What if there was more to this story than met the eye? These questions swirled in her mind like storm clouds, dark and ominous. And deep down, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let it go, not yet. Not until she found answers. When the phone finally rang, connecting her to someone powerful enough to dig deeper, Judge Harper picked it up with resolve. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about truth. And sometimes finding the truth required taking risks, even if it meant questioning your own decisions. Little did she know, that single phone call would set off a chain of events that would rock the foundations of power, challenge loyalties, and uncover secrets buried so deeply that no one dared speak of them aloud. But for now, the world only saw the surface, the fall of a once revered hero. What lay beneath remained hidden, waiting to be unearthed. The line crackled faintly as Judge Harper waited for the call to connect. Her fingers tapped nervously on the edge of her desk, a gesture so unlike her usual composed self. The weight of what she was about to do pressed heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't just questioning a verdict she had delivered, she was stepping into murky waters where politics, power, and secrets intertwined. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. It belonged to a high-ranking official at the Pentagon, someone whose name carried enough authority to make even seasoned generals think twice before speaking out of turn. "This is Secretary Langley," the voice said, calm but guarded. "Secretary Langley," Judge Harper began, choosing her words carefully. "I need to speak with you about something urgent, something that might change how we look at a recent case involving one of your senior officers." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Go ahead, Your Honor," Langley replied, his tone shifting slightly, curiosity creeping in. Harper took a deep breath. "Today I sentenced an Army general to life imprisonment for embezzlement. But there are things about this case that don't sit right with me. I believe it's possible he's innocent, and if he is, then whoever framed him has gone to great lengths to make sure he takes the fall." Another pause followed, longer this time. When Langley spoke again, his voice was low and measured. "You're talking about General Thompson, aren't you?" "Yes," Harper confirmed, "and I'm not saying this lightly. During the trial, there were inconsistencies, small details that didn't align. Witnesses seemed rehearsed, almost too perfect in their testimonies. And then there's the timing. Why now? Why target someone who's been nothing but loyal to the military for decades?" Langley let out a slow sigh. "Your Honor, I won't pretend I haven't heard whispers about this. There have been rumors floating around the Pentagon for months, rumors about certain individuals trying to discredit leaders they see as threats. Leaders like General Thompson." Harper leaned forward, her interest piqued. "What kind of threats?" "Well," Langley explained, "General Thompson recently launched an initiative to audit funds being used for overseas operations. He wanted transparency, something many people in positions of power aren't exactly eager to provide. If someone discovered wrongdoing within those funds, well, let's just say not everyone would welcome that kind of scrutiny." A chill ran down Harper's spine. She had suspected foul play, but hearing it confirmed, even indirectly, was sobering. "So you're telling me this could be bigger than just one man?" "It's possible," Langley admitted. "If what you're saying is true, then we're dealing with more than a simple miscarriage of justice. This could be part of a larger effort to silence anyone who gets too close to uncovering the truth." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gravity of the situation hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Harper thought back to the courtroom earlier that day. The general's stoic expression, the looks of disbelief from his supporters, the smug satisfaction radiating from the prosecution team. Had she played a role in something far darker than she realized? "I need your help," she said finally, breaking the silence. "If there's even a chance he's innocent, we owe it to him, and to the system we represent, to find out the truth." Langley hesitated. What she was asking wasn't easy. Investigating such a high-profile case would require resources, discretion, and a willingness to confront powerful adversaries. But he also knew she was right. Justice couldn't exist without truth, no matter how inconvenient or dangerous it might be. "All right," he said firmly. "I'll put together a team to dig deeper. Off the record, of course. We'll start by reviewing the evidence and cross-referencing it with any internal reports we can access. If there's anything suspicious, we'll find it." "Thank you," Harper said, relief washing over her. "But remember, time is critical here. Every day he spends in prison is another day the real culprits walk free." "Understood," Langley replied. "I'll reach out once we have something concrete." When the call ended, Harper sat back in her chair staring at the phone. For the first time since the trial, she felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't condemned an innocent man after all. But hope wasn't enough. Not yet. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Still, she couldn't shake the image of the general standing in that courtroom, accepting his fate with quiet dignity. Was he truly guilty? Or was he paying the price for daring to challenge the status quo? Either way, the answer mattered. Not just for him, but for everyone who believed in fairness and accountability. As the afternoon sun filtered through the windows of her chambers, casting long shadows across the room, Judge Harper made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't rest until she uncovered the truth. no matter where it led. Because sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks, and this was one risk she was willing to take. Little did she know, the investigation she had set in motion would unearth secrets buried so deeply that they threatened to upend everything. She thought she knew about power, loyalty, and justice, but for now all she could do was wait and hope that the truth would eventually come to light. At the Pentagon, Secretary Langley wasted no time. He knew what was at stake, not just the fate of one man, but the integrity of an entire system. If the allegations Judge Harper had raised were true, then the implications went far beyond a single courtroom. This wasn't just about justice, it was about trust. Trust in the military, trust in leadership, and trust in the idea that truth could still prevail in a world full of shadows. Langley called together a small group of trusted individuals, analysts, investigators, and intelligence officers who had proven their loyalty and discretion over the years. They gathered in a secure conference room deep within the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors. The atmosphere was tense, almost electric, as Langley laid out the situation. "This isn't a routine investigation," he began, his voice low but firm. "We're looking into something that could expose corruption at the highest levels. Someone has gone to great lengths to frame a senior officer, a decorated war hero, and we need to figure out why." The team exchanged glances, some nodding grimly while others scribbled notes. One of them, a seasoned investigator named Carter, leaned forward. "Sir, if I may ask, do we have any leads? Any starting point?" Langley nodded. "We start with the evidence presented during the trial. Financial records, emails, witness testimonies, all of it needs to be re-examined. But here's the catch. Whoever did this didn't leave loose ends, so we'll have to dig deeper than usual. Look for patterns, anomalies, anything that doesn't fit." With that directive, the team got to work. For days, they pored over classified documents, tracing every transaction, every communication, every shred of evidence tied to the case. At first, it seemed like a dead end. Everything appeared legitimate, airtight even. That is, until they stumbled upon something unusual. Buried in the financial records was a series of transfers labeled as miscellaneous operational expenses. On the surface, they looked harmless enough. Money moving between accounts to fund routine activities overseas. But when cross-referenced with internal audit reports, discrepancies began to emerge. Large sums of money were being funneled into unmarked accounts that didn't officially exist according to Pentagon records. Carter brought this discovery to Langley immediately. "Sir, take a look at this," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were detailed breakdowns of the suspicious transactions. These funds weren't used for troop welfare or equipment upgrades like they were supposed to be. Instead, they ended up in private offshore accounts linked to individuals outside the chain of command. Langley frowned, studying the documents closely. "Who are these people?" he asked. "That's the thing. We don't know yet," Carter admitted. "But based on the account activity, it looks like they're using the money to finance operations that aren't sanctioned by the military, Black Ops arms deals, you name it." The pieces started coming together. Whoever was behind this wasn't just stealing money. They were manipulating the system to serve their own agenda. And framing the general? That was likely a way to eliminate anyone who might interfere. But the real breakthrough came when the team turned its attention to the witnesses who had testified against the general. Using advanced surveillance tools, they reviewed footage of key witnesses taken both before and after the trial. What they found sent shockwaves through the room. One witness, a mid-level bureaucrat, had been seen meeting with a shadowy figure in a parking garage late at night. Another, a former colleague of the general, had received large deposits into his personal bank account shortly before giving testimony. It was clear these people hadn't come forward willingly. They'd been pressured or paid to lie under oath. Langley felt a mix of anger and frustration bubbling inside him. How could something like this happen right under their noses? How many others might be involved, quietly complicit in keeping these secrets hidden? He called another meeting with Judge Harper to update her on the findings. When she answered the phone, her voice carried a note of cautious optimism. "Tell me you've found something," she said without preamble. "We have," Langley replied. "It's worse than we thought. There's a network operating within the military, siphoning off funds for unauthorized purposes, and they targeted the general because he was getting too close to exposing them." Harper fell silent, absorbing the information. Finally, she spoke. "If this gets out, it could destroy public confidence in the military. People will demand answers, and heads will roll." "Exactly," Langley agreed. "Which is why we need to handle this carefully. We can't afford to tip our hand until we have irrefutable proof. Otherwise, they'll cover their tracks faster than we can act." "What's the next step?" Harper asked. "We keep digging," Langley said. "And once we have enough evidence, we move quickly. Arrests will need to be coordinated, statements prepared, and the media briefed. This is going to be messy, but it has to be done." As the call ended, Harper couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief that the truth was finally coming to light, but also dread at the scale of what they were uncovering. She thought about the general, sitting alone in his cell, unaware that wheels were turning to clear his name. Would he ever forgive her for sentencing him in the first place? Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon, the investigation intensified. The team worked around the clock, following leads and connecting dots. Each new revelation painted a clearer picture of a conspiracy that reached higher and wider than anyone had anticipated. High-ranking officials, contractors, even foreign entities, all were implicated in a web of deceit designed to protect their interests at any cost. Despite the mounting pressure, Langley remained resolute. "We're not just fighting for one man," he reminded his team during a late-night briefing. "We're fighting for the soul of this institution. If we let this slide, we lose everything we stand for." And so, the battle continued. A quiet, relentless pursuit of truth in a world built on lies. Every document reviewed, every lead chased, brought them closer to the moment when justice would finally be served. But as dawn broke over Washington, D.C., casting golden light across the city, none of them could predict how far-reaching the fallout would be, or how many lives it would change forever. The day the first arrests were made, it felt like a storm had finally broken, after weeks of suffocating tension. Secretary Langley's team moved swiftly and quietly, coordinating with federal agents to round up key players in the shadowy network they'd uncovered. Each arrest was carried out under the cover of darkness, away from prying eyes and news cameras. The goal wasn't just to catch these individuals. It was to dismantle the entire operation without giving anyone time to destroy evidence or flee. By morning, whispers began spreading through the corridors of power. High-ranking officials who had once walked with confidence now looked over their shoulders, wondering if they'd be next. Some tried to distance themselves from the scandal, deleting emails, shredding documents, or calling in favors to protect themselves. But it was too late. The net had been cast wide, and no one involved could escape unnoticed. Back at the Pentagon, Langley briefed Judge Harper on the progress. "We've got several people in custody already," he told her over a secure line. "Some are talking. Others aren't, but we're piecing together enough to build a solid case. It's ugly, though. Dirtier than I thought possible." Harper listened intently, gripping the phone tightly. "What about the general?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "When do we tell him?" "Soon," Langley promised. "But we can't rush this. If word gets out that we're reopening his case, it could spook the rest of the conspirators. We need to keep moving carefully until we have everything tied up." Harper nodded, even though Langley couldn't see her. She understood the stakes, but patience didn't come easily when an innocent man was locked away for a crime he didn't commit. Still, she trusted Langley to handle things properly. For now, all she could do was wait. Meanwhile, behind bars, the general remained unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. His days passed in monotony, meals delivered at set times, brief exercise periods in a fenced yard, and long hours spent staring at the walls of his cell. At first, anger had consumed him, the kind of raw, seething fury that comes from being betrayed by the very system you'd sworn to serve. But as weeks turned into months, that anger gave way to something quieter, heavier: resignation. He spent most of his time writing letters to his family, to old friends, to anyone willing to listen. In those letters, he poured out his thoughts, his frustrations, his hopes for vindication someday. He wrote about the soldiers he'd led, the battles he'd fought, the sacrifices he'd made. Writing became his lifeline, a way to hold on to, his humanity in a place designed to strip it away. One afternoon, as he sat on the edge of his cot scribbling another letter, a guard approached his cell. "You've got a visitor," the man said gruffly. The general blinked, surprised. Visitors were rare. Most people had either abandoned him or believed the worst. Curious and slightly wary, he followed the guard to the visiting area. There, sitting across the table, was Judge Harper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The general stared at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he broke the silence. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone measured but laced with skepticism. "I came to apologize," Harper said simply. Her voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I sentenced you based on evidence that I now believe was fabricated. You deserve to know that." The general leaned back in his chair, processing her words. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers for why she hadn't seen through the lies sooner. But another part, a deeper, more instinctive part, recognized the sincerity in her apology. This wasn't a woman trying to save face. This was someone genuinely seeking redemption. "Why should I believe you?" he asked finally, his voice soft but firm. "Because I'm working to prove your innocence," Harper replied. "And because I owe it to you, not just as a judge, but as a human being." That response hit him harder than he expected. He'd spent so long bracing himself against disappointment, against betrayal, that hearing someone take responsibility felt almost foreign. Slowly, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Tell me what's going on." Harper explained everything: the investigation, the arrests, the conspiracy that had framed him. As she spoke, the general's posture shifted. His shoulders relaxed, and a flicker of hope returned to his eyes. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond these walls. While Harper worked to rebuild trust with the general, Langley and his team continued their efforts to expose the truth. They compiled mountains of evidence: financial, records, surveillance footage, witness statements, all pointing to a coordinated effort to discredit the general and protect a corrupt network. With each new discovery, the picture became clearer. This wasn't just about money or greed. It was about control. Those involved feared the general's push for transparency because it threatened their ability to operate unchecked. When the evidence was ready, Langley called another meeting with Harper. "It's time," he said. "We have enough to overturn the conviction, but we need to act fast. Once the public learns about this, it's going to blow up." Harper agreed. Together they devised a plan to bring the general's case back to court under the guise of a routine appeal. To avoid tipping off the remaining conspirators, they kept the details vague, focusing instead on procedural errors and newly discovered evidence. It was risky. Every step had to be precise, but it was the only way to ensure the general's freedom without jeopardizing the larger investigation. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters packed the benches, eager for any hint of drama. Supporters of the general filled the rows, holding signs and murmuring prayers. Even some detractors showed up, curious to see how this chapter would unfold. Judge Harper took her seat at the bench, her expression calm but resolute. After a few preliminary remarks, she addressed the room directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "new evidence has come to light that calls into question the validity of the original verdict in this case. Based on this evidence, I am compelled to reopen the proceedings and vacate the previous judgment." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled for their notepads, and the general sat motionless, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Harper continued, her voice strong and unwavering. "General, you are hereby declared innocent of all charges. I deeply regret the injustice you have endured, and offer my sincerest apologies on behalf of the court." Tears welled up in the eyes of the general's loved ones as the reality sank in. He rose slowly, steadying himself against the table. For a moment he simply stood there, absorbing the weight of the moment. Then turning to Harper, he nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her courage in righting the wrong. As the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, Harper felt a wave of relief wash over her. This wasn't the end of the road, far from it. There were still questions to answer, accountability to enforce, and reforms to implement. But for the first time in months, justice felt within reach. Outside, the world waited anxiously for answers. News outlets broadcast live updates, speculating about the scope of the scandal and its implications. Politicians issued statements, some condemning the corruption, others deflecting blame. Amidst the chaos, one thing was clear: the fight for truth wasn't over. But thanks to the determination of a few brave individuals, the tide was beginning to turn. The general stepped out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, squinting as the cameras flashed around him. For the first time in months, he felt the warmth of freedom, not just physical freedom, but the kind that came from knowing the truth was finally being acknowledged. Supporters cheered loudly, holding up banners and chanting his name. Reporters shouted questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. But the general didn't answer them. Instead, he paused for a moment, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. It wasn't easy to adjust to life outside prison. The world had moved on without him, and catching up felt like trying to piece together fragments of a shattered mirror. His family welcomed him back with open arms, but even they noticed how much he'd changed. He was quieter now, more reflective, as if the weight of everything he'd endured had etched itself into his soul. Nights were the hardest. Sleep eluded him, haunted by memories of the cell and the faces of those who had betrayed him. But the general wasn't one to wallow in bitterness. Slowly, he began rebuilding his life. With the full support of the Pentagon, he became an advocate for reform, pushing for greater transparency within the military's financial systems. He spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds, and met with lawmakers to propose changes that would prevent similar scandals in the future. It was exhausting work, but it gave him purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Judge Harper played a crucial role in this process. Their bond, forged through shared guilt and redemption, grew stronger over time. She often joined him at public events, standing beside him as they called for accountability and integrity. Together, they made an unlikely yet powerful duo: the judge who had sentenced an innocent man and later fought to free him, and the soldier who had risen above injustice to demand better for others. Their partnership didn't go unnoticed. Critics accused them of grandstanding, claiming they were using the scandal to boost their own reputations. Others praised their courage, hailing them as heroes who had exposed corruption when no one else dared. Through it all, the general remained humble. "This isn't about me," he said during one interview. "It's about making sure no one else has to suffer because of lies and greed." Meanwhile, the fallout from the scandal continued to ripple across the nation. Arrests mounted as investigators uncovered more layers of the conspiracy. Some of the accused struck plea deals, spilling secrets in exchange for reduced sentences. Others dug in their heels, hiring high-profile lawyers to fight the charges. Trials dominated headlines for months, sparking debates about power, privilege, and accountability. Public outrage reached a fever pitch when classified documents leaked. To the press revealed the extent of the corruption. Millions of dollars had been funneled into unauthorized operations, some of which violated international laws. Foreign governments demanded answers, while citizens questioned whether their leaders could ever be trusted again. Protesters took to the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice over greed" and "Expose the shadows." Amidst the chaos, Secretary Langley faced immense pressure. Lawmakers grilled him during congressional hearings, demanding explanations for how such widespread corruption had gone undetected for so long. Allies urged him to resign, fearing the scandal might tarnish the entire administration. But Langley refused to step down. "If I leave now," he told his advisors, "it will look like we're running from the problem instead of fixing it. We owe it to the people to see this through." Langley's determination earned him respect. even from critics. Under his leadership, sweeping reforms were implemented to increase oversight and prevent future abuses. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, audit protocols tightened, and independent review boards established. These measures weren't perfect, but they marked a significant step toward rebuilding trust. For the general, though, the road to healing was personal as well as professional. He leaned heavily on his family during this time, drawing strength from their unwavering support. His wife, in particular, became his anchor. She listened patiently as he vented his frustrations, held his hand during sleepless nights, and reminded him daily of why he mattered. "You've already given so much," she told him one evening. "Don't let them take any more of you." Her words stuck with him. Slowly, he began opening up, not just to her, but to friends, colleagues, and even strangers who reached out to share their own stories of injustice. Many had followed his case closely, finding inspiration in his resilience. Veterans thanked him for shining a light on issues they'd long suspected but couldn't prove. Civilians expressed gratitude for reminding them that truth and justice were worth fighting for. One day, while visiting a community center for veterans, the general found himself surrounded by young soldiers eager to hear his story. They asked thoughtful questions. "How did you stay strong? What advice do you have for us? Do you think real change is possible?" He answered honestly, sharing both his struggles and his hopes for the future. "You'll face challenges," he told them, "moments when it feels like the system is working against you. But don't lose faith. Stand your ground, speak your truth, and find allies who believe in doing what's right. Change starts small, with one person willing to say, 'This isn't okay.'" His words resonated deeply with the crowd. As he left the center that evening, several young soldiers approached him to shake his hand. One of them handed him a folded piece of paper. "We wrote this for you," the soldier said shyly. Inside was a note signed by everyone in attendance. "Thank you for showing us that courage still exists." Despite the progress, scars remained. The general often thought about the men and women he'd served alongside, the ones who hadn't lived to see justice served. He carried their memories with him, letting them fuel his resolve. Judge Harper, too, struggled with lingering doubts. Had she done enough? Could she have acted sooner? These questions haunted her, but she channeled them into action, continuing to push for systemic improvements. Together they became symbols of hope, not because they were perfect, but because they represented the messy, imperfect process of seeking justice. They proved that even in the darkest moments, people could come together to demand better. And sometimes that collective effort could spark real change. As months turned into years, the scandal faded from the headlines, replaced by new crises and controversies. But its impact endured. Reforms enacted during that turbulent period reshaped policies and practices, ensuring greater accountability within institutions. And the general's story lived on, inspiring countless individuals to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Because in the end, justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty or freeing the innocent. It was about creating a world where truth mattered more than power, where fairness outweighed convenience, and where courage triumphed over fear. Years passed, and the scandal that had once dominated headlines became a distant memory for most people. Life moved on, as it always does. But for those who had lived through it, the general, Judge Harper, Secretary Langley, and countless others, it left an indelible mark. The events of that time shaped not only their lives, but also the course of history in ways they could never have imagined. The general eventually retired from public life, choosing to spend his days quietly with family and close friends. He bought a small house by a lake, far away from the chaos of cities and politics. It wasn't luxury, but it was peaceful, a place where he could reflect without distractions. Every morning, he'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the water. Those moments of stillness gave him clarity, reminding him of what truly mattered. But retirement didn't mean silence. Though he stepped back from the spotlight, his influence continued to ripple outward. Books were written about his story, documentaries filmed, and speeches given celebrating his journey from wrongful imprisonment to becoming a beacon of hope for marginalized voices everywhere. Schools named auditoriums after him, Community centers invited him to speak, and veterans groups honored him with awards. His name became synonymous with resilience, integrity, and the relentless pursuit of justice. For Judge Harper, the experience transformed her career and her perspective. She remained on the bench presiding over cases with a renewed sense of purpose. No longer content to simply follow the law, she sought to understand the humanity behind each case, asking herself not just what is legal, but what is fair. Her reputation grew, earning her recognition as one of the most compassionate yet principled judges in the country. Young lawyers looked up to her, inspired by her willingness to admit mistakes and fight for what was right. One day, during a mentorship program at a local law school, a student asked her, "How do you know when to take a stand? What if you're wrong?" Harper smiled softly, recalling her own doubts and fears. "You'll never have all the answers," she admitted. "But here's the thing, doing nothing is often worse than making a mistake. Justice isn't perfect. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But if you act with good intentions and stay open to learning, you can make a difference." Her words resonated deeply with the students, many of whom went on to become advocates for reform themselves. In a way, Harper's legacy extended beyond the courtroom, touching lives she would never meet. As for Secretary Langley, he retired from government service shortly after implementing the sweeping reforms. Though some criticized him for waiting too long to address systemic issues, no one could deny the impact of his efforts. Under his leadership, transparency became a cornerstone of military operations, and accountability measures ensured that power couldn't be abused without consequence. When he passed away years later, tributes poured in from around the world, praising him as a man who had chosen to lead with integrity rather than ambition. The scandal also sparked broader cultural shifts. Conversations about corruption, accountability, and trust entered mainstream discourse, forcing institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Activists used the momentum to push for changes in other areas: healthcare, education, law enforcement, all united by the belief that transparency and fairness should be non-negotiable values. In communities across the nation, ordinary citizens found inspiration in the general story. A young teacher started a project to teach students about civic responsibility. A factory worker organized a campaign to hold local leaders accountable. A single mother began volunteering at a nonprofit, fighting for prison reform. Each of them carried a piece of the general spirit with them, proving that even small actions could create waves of change. Looking back, the general often thought about the moment when everything had shifted: the phone call Judge Harper made to the Pentagon, the investigation that followed, the arrests, the overturned verdict. It amazed him how one decision, one brave act, could set off a chain reaction that altered so many lives. He realized that justice wasn't something handed down from above. It was built from the ground up, brick, by people willing to stand up for what was right. On the anniversary of his release, he returned to the courthouse where it had all unfolded. The building looked the same, its stone facade weathered but sturdy. Standing outside, he remembered the mix of fear and hope he'd felt that day. So much had changed since then. For him, for the country, for the world. A young reporter approached him, notebook in hand. "Sir, can I ask you something?" she said hesitantly. "What do you want people to remember about your story?" The general thought for a moment before answering. "I want them to remember that justice isn't easy," he said finally. "It takes courage, patience, and a lot of hard work. Sometimes it feels like the odds are stacked against you. But if you keep pushing, keep believing, you might just find a way to make things better, not just for yourself, but for everyone." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. To the people who had followed his journey, he was more than a symbol of resilience or redemption. He was proof that even in the darkest times, light could break through, if enough people dared to let it shine. And so the legacy of the general, Judge Harper, and everyone else involved in the scandal lived on, not as a tale of perfect heroes or flawless victories, but as a reminder that justice was worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle. Because in the end, it wasn't about being fearless. It was about finding the strength to act despite fear. And that lesson, simple, yet profound, would endure long after the headlines faded and the cameras stopped rolling.